Okay, so as hopefully all of you know, today is the last class before the first test. How do you guys feel? Good, okay, good to hear. Okay, so today we'll be starting off by finishing chapter 2. That should take about half an hour, maybe a little bit less. And then the remaining 40 to 50 minutes will be for you guys to ask any questions, maybe start to think about topics you'd like to ask questions about. If there aren't very many questions, I will just do a quick kind of crash course run through what I take to be the most important parts of chapters 1 and 2. So that's what we'll be doing today. And we're going to start with the topic that I finished with last time but didn't quite get to say everything, and that's the p-value and statistical significance. So returning to the p-value, as I said last time, is the probability of getting your results if there's no real effect. Therefore, you want the p-value to be low. It can range from 0 to 1, and you want it to be closer to 0. If it's closer to 0, that means that it is unlikely that you would have gotten your results just by chance. I used an example last time about sex differences in video game behavior, but I'll use another example. Suppose you have a new drug, like a new antidepressant, and you want to test whether it works. So of course we would have a placebo condition and a antidepressant condition. And let's say it's, that's really embarrassing. I forget if there's 1P or, there's 1P. That's how you know I didn't sleep well enough last night. So there's a placebo condition and an antidepressant condition. And let's say it's a very simple dependent measure. It's how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10. And let's say in the placebo condition, at the end of it, they are 6.13 out of 10 on average. That's the average happiness. And in this condition, it's 6.14. Okay. Now, it's possible that the antidepressant is a piece of trash. It doesn't really work. So what you want to ask is, how likely is it that we would get this result if the antidepressant doesn't really work? And it's not that unlikely, right? It's not that big of a difference. In fact, there's a pretty good chance this is just statistical noise. There's just a few more happy people in this condition, and the drug doesn't really work. The p-value might be like 0.8. I mean, you'd have to know more information, but it would be pretty close to 1, actually. But to make it really extreme, let's suppose instead that the antidepressant group had a happiness score of 9.62. Okay, now, p-value is going to be pretty small. It's pretty unlikely you get a difference that big if the drug doesn't work. So that's what we want. We want small p-values. This is true not just in psychology, but biology, other social sciences, etc. So the p-value here, you have to know more information, but it might be like 0.001. Right? Be very, very small. Statistical significance means that the p-value is less than 0.05. Or you could just say 0.05. Doesn't really matter. So you set a cutoff. Typically the cutoff is 0.05. And you say, if the p-value is less than that cutoff, we will conclude it's a real effect, not just noise. And the reason we set it low is we want to be very confident that it's a real effect. We're setting kind of a high bar. We want it to be very unlikely that you would get this result just by chance. However, this creates a bit of a perverse incentive structure. Because in psychology scientific journals, they will typically only accept a result if the p-value is less than 0.05. If it's 0.07 or 0.1 or 0.15, we don't believe you, we're not going to accept the results. And so prior to the early 2010s, it was very common for researchers to do something called p-hacking. That's not a term that you need to know, but basically they would just play with the data, try lots of different statistical tests, until they got one result that was less than 0.05, that was statistically significant, and then that is the result they would write up for a paper and send to a journal. But that's a problem, right? Because if you do enough statistical tests, eventually, just by chance, one of them is going to be below 0.05. At least it's very likely that will happen. This is widely believed to be one of the main problems underlying the replication crisis, which I mentioned last time. It was discovered in the early 2010s that a lot of famous psychology findings did not replicate. One funny example, if you look up TED Talks, if you look up like the 10 most famous, most watched TED Talks, one of them is about power posing. There was a study done which found that if you do a power pose, like some kind of confident pose for like 30 seconds before a job interview or some other stressful thing, your testosterone would go up and your cortisol would go down. So in the TED Talk, the researcher says, this is all you gotta do. Just before a job interview, just do this for like 30 seconds. Your testosterone will shoot up and your cortisol will go down. You'll be stress-free, ready to do the interview. You might be thinking, that sounds too good to be true. And it is. The result does not replicate. That's one example. So nowadays, the big word in psychology that people are emphasizing, which I mentioned in the notes, is pre-registration. This will not be on the test. This is just for any of you going on into psychology or other sciences. In pre-registration, you tie your own hands behind your back. You say that you publish a pre-registration and you say, I'm going to do these statistical tests, I'm going to exclude these people, and if I don't find a p-value less than 0.05, I'm going to report that, look, we didn't find what we were looking for. I mention exclusions because one common way of trying to get a p-value below 0.05 is to take advantage of the fact that it's up to you as the researcher who to exclude from the data set. And you have to exclude some people. There's no way around that. Like in my studies, we exclude people who spend less than 5 minutes on the survey. Because it should take at least 20 minutes. If you're taking less than 5 minutes, you are just randomly clicking, you're out. But you might look at the data set and go, I don't know, 10 minutes, those people look like they're clicking randomly too. Maybe we should exclude those people. And what some researchers would do is just kind of play with the exclusion criteria until they got a p-value less than 0.05. But with this, you force yourself to not do that. Now, you still can play with the data set afterwards if you want. You think, no, maybe these people should be excluded too. But then you just have to admit that that's what you did. You have to say, look, we were kind of doing an exploratory study. We were playing with the data set in these other ways. It wasn't what we were originally predicting. Now, since this stuff is a little bit more advanced, it actually isn't, most of this is not in the book, but I think it's very important. I'm going to give you guys one free multiple choice question. I'm going to tell you roughly what the question is about this stuff. It's the only free multiple choice question you get, but I felt a little guilty that I was giving you guys some advanced stuff. If you didn't understand half of what I just said, all you need to know for the test is that statistical significance means that the p-value is less than 0.05. If you know that, you'll be good. The rest of this you can just bury away in your brain and hopefully use it later in your education. But for the test, that's all you need to know. 0.5. Yeah, there is no 1.5. It's from 0 to 1.
0.05.
Oh, sorry, it's 0.05. Yes, thank you. You guys got that one. I would feel bad about that. 0.05, or less than 5% likely. That's what 0.05 means. So you want it to be less than 5% likely that you would get the result if there's no effect. That's what 0.05 means. Thank you for clarifying. Any other questions about this before I move on? Yes?
How do you calculate the p-value? It seems very bizarre.
You don't have to know, but for whatever it involves calculus. You basically have to set up a distribution of all the possible Depends what you're measuring, but it could be possible correlations, for example. So it's like a curve of possibilities that you could get with a sample that big, and then you look at the area under the curve past a certain effect size. Yeah. But you don't have to know that because there's no calculus in this class. Thank God. Any other questions? Okay. And even if you go on to upper level psychology classes, you never have to calculate the p-values in calculus. You just look it up in a table. You let someone else do the calculus for you. Okay. Another term that you should know, the book mentions around the same section, is meta-analysis. This is widely considered to be the gold standard in research. Let's say there's lots of different studies on the same pattern, and they all find slightly different results. For example, there are a number of studies looking at sex differences in different cognitive tests. So some studies find that women have a slight edge in verbal fluency and some other verbal tasks, and some studies find that men on average have an advantage in tests of mental rotation. But some studies don't find the same effect. So if you were going to do a meta-analysis, what you would do is pool all of the studies together. Just go on Google Scholar, find all the studies you can find on a given phenomenon, and average them together. So some studies find no effect, some find a big effect, some find a small effect. Okay, well when you pool them all together, what's the average effect size for, whatever it is? So as I said, that's widely considered to be the gold standard. It has its own problems, but it's kind of as good as you can do. Another thing, another practice that is in recent years becoming much more emphasized is cross-cultural replication. So I talked a bit about replication in general, but one type of replication that's recently becoming more important is cross-cultural. You can probably guess what this means. Prior to recent years, many of the most important effects in psychology had only been studied in Western samples. Actually, to be more specific, there's a term that's used a lot in the literature, WEIRD. A little acronyms, meaning, I heard some whispering some of it, so Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies. You don't need to know all the things for the test or anything, but basically Canada, the United States, Western Europe, New Zealand, Australia, that's where most psychological research had been done. And then some fellas had the bright idea to ask, well, a lot of countries are not there. Is the pattern of results the same? So, for example, there's a very famous finding in social psychology that you'll learn about in 105 called the fundamental attribution error, which you do not need to write down, but it's a certain bias that I won't go into, but lots of studies found that it was a very important bias. And that's part of why it was called the fundamental attribution error, because there was so much evidence for it that it was taken to be kind of a core feature of human nature. But then some researchers looked at East Asian samples and other samples and found that in many non-Western cultures, the effect was either not there at all or at least greatly reduced. And there are some spooky examples of this. I mean, one example that we'll talk about in chapter 5 in this class is visual illusions. You might think, oh, visual illusions, surely that is just, in our genes or in our brains. Culture couldn't possibly have any effect there. But it turns out there are certain visual illusions that people who are not in developed countries do not fall for. So culture can even affect something as basic as how you perceive shapes. So a lot of work being done on this right now, and I think it's very important. Okay, last section that we have to cover is the section on ethics, research ethics. The reason we have this is there were a number of experiments, especially in social psychology, that were done in the history of psychology that were, let's be generous and call them ethically questionable. The word questionable is doing some heavy lifting there. One example that many of you may have heard of, there's some movies and documentaries about this, is the Milgram obedience study. Have any of you heard of this study? Handful. Okay, so Milgram was a Jewish fella, and this study was done in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust. And he was interested in how it was possible for otherwise normal people, and many of the Nazis were otherwise normal, how were they capable of doing such horrible, unspeakably evil things? And you might think, the Germans, they're just evil or whatever. I don't know, maybe. But Milgram wanted to see if he could get Americans to do evil things just by having an authority figure tell them what to do. And I won't go into all the details, but basically he put subjects in a situation where they had to electrocute someone for getting questions wrong. They would teach the subject would teach another person word pairs, and if they got it wrong, they had to zap them. Now, of course, it was an actor in another room just screaming, and he wasn't really being electrocuted, but if you watch footage, pretty damn convincing screaming. And the way it worked was there was a kind of a panel of switches, and it ranged from 15 volts to 450 volts, at which point I think it said like XXX danger or something. And around, I think it's around 150 volts, they start screaming, and they say they have a heart condition. Around 300, the screaming gets really loud, and they say, my heart's bothering me, or whatever. And after around 350, they go silent. And you are told, and I forgot the most important part. Milgram is there with a lab coat telling you must continue. You have to keep electrocuting them if they get the question wrong. After 350, you are told, if they say nothing, that means they got it wrong and you have to zap them again. So here's the question. How many people went to 300, so like they're screaming, and how many went to 450? Think of what your guess is. Here's the right answer. 100% went to 300, and 65% went all the way to 450. So a bunch of random, average American Joes were willing to, as far as they could tell, kill somebody, zap someone over and over again after they were unconscious, just because some dude in a lab coat was like, you must do this, you have to do this. So pretty shocking result, and very well replicated. Milgram was a good scientist, unlike the guy we'll talk about next. He did do a lot of replications. But pretty messed up. I'm seeing a lot of nods. You're making someone think they killed somebody. That's messed up. Now, to be fair to Milgram, they did debrief the subjects at the end, saying, hey, look, that guy's not really dead. Like, he was an actor. But still, you can see footage of this online. They're really distressed when they're deciding whether or not to zap people. So that's one, as I say, ethically questionable study that you would absolutely not get away with doing today. The other famous one is the Zimbardo prison study. How many of you have heard of this one? It might be slightly more famous. Yeah. So instead of me explaining it, I'm going to show a quick clip of this. This is from a longer documentary. I'm just going to show maybe like 3-4 minutes of it, just so you get the idea. So yeah, if you didn't get to the basic gist, they took Stanford basement and turned it into a prison, and had half the subjects be guards and half be prisoners. I'll note in passing, this study makes me angry for multiple reasons. I mean, obviously there's the ethical issues, but also it's widely cited alongside Milgram's study. And that angers me because Milgram, even though he was ethically questionable, was a very good scientist and did really good, careful replications. The Zimbardo study, I and many other psychologists regard as essentially fraudulent because he presented the results as if it was the situation that made the guards bad. You heard that in the video, right? Just the environment, as soon as they have this role, they become sadistic and horrible. Unfortunately, Milgram kept good notes, and it's very clear that he told the guards to be assholes. Which is fine, and then just say it's an obedience study, but he presented it as if it was the situation. Now, you don't need to know that, that's just my own irritation with the study. But the important takeaway, of course, is that that's pretty messed up too, obviously, so we would never do a study like that nowadays. These studies spurned the emergence of ethical review boards, or ERBs. ERBs are required in all university research settings. Before a psychologist does any study with human subjects, they must submit their proposal to an ERB. Even if it's like a survey. So every time I do a survey here at the U of A or any other kind of study, I have to write up what I'm going to do, submit it to these fellas, and they have to approve the study. Everyone in my lab knows that I sort of hate the ERBs, not because I don't think it's important that they check for the ethics, but they spend most of their time annoying me with stupid stuff. Just recently, I was submitting an amendment asking if I could put posters up around the university advertising my study, and I listed the lab email, NSN lab email, and they said, no, that's not ethical. You have to add your email too. I said, well, thank God we have you guys. What would we do without you? So there's a lot of that shit that kind of annoys me, but they obviously are necessary because of the kinds of things that I talked about. One thing that they insist on, and I think rightly so, is informed consent. Informed meaning you have to tell them up front about all of the potentially upsetting or difficult parts of your study. You give them like a consent form that they sign or click yes to if it's a survey. So most of you will be doing some form of survey. Yes, sir.
Who sits on these review boards? Is it like
Staff. I don't think it's normally faculty. At my undergrad place, it was a few faculty, but I think some people literally just have the job of annoying me. Sorry, I didn't say that. Hopefully the ethics people never. I think they have contempt for me too. I sometimes give kind of snotty replies to them. I was so close one time to making a bad joke because I sent an amendment asking if I could extend the deadline because the study is only approved for 1 year, and I submitted an amendment saying, can I have an extension for 6 months because I want to collect more people. I said I want to collect more subjects. And they're like, no, you have to give a reason why you're changing the date. I was like, I was really tempted to write because people can't time travel. I need more people. I didn't, but I should. Sorry, I lost track of your question. Yes, so it's sometimes, again, hopefully they don't watch this, but sometimes it's university staff whose specific job is this, and sometimes it's faculty, but you don't need to know that. Now, here's the part that might be a little surprising to you, we are allowed to use some deception. I was going to say for informed consent. As an example, when I do my moral psychology studies, some of the dilemmas are potentially upsetting, right? They involve like death or suffering, not in right in front, but thinking about the possibility of death or suffering. I have to tell people that. You may think about some things that are upsetting. Do you still wish to participate? And they can still leave at any time, even if they consented at the beginning. But we are allowed to engage in some degree of deception. For example, I've done some studies on confirmation bias, but I didn't want people to know that I was studying confirmation bias. So I called it like memory study or something, and said it was a study about memory. And I would give them arguments for and against their beliefs in the survey, and they had to rate how convincing they were. I was looking at how much more convincing they found studies that agree with what they already think. But I also included like memory checks, like what was the previous study about. And I led them on to think that that's what I was interested in. Because I didn't want them thinking like, ooh, am I being biased or not? Because that might mess up the results. And that's not uncommon. It's relatively common for researchers to be vague or sometimes deceptive about what the study is about. If you do that, you have to mention it in what's called the debriefing form. So as the book says, at the end of every study, you have a debriefing form in which you say what your hypothesis was, why you included the variables that you did, and a bit stuff like that. So if you did any deception, you have to say it in the debriefing. You have to say, look, I told you this was about memory, but really it was about confirmation bias. I just didn't want you to change your answers because of that fact. So that's a bit about research ethics. Any questions about? Yes.
What are the
Sorry.
what are the ramifications for ethical violations?
I don't know. I've never been caught with one. I've never done one, but I presume there's some kind of disciplinary procedure. I did once get a complaint. There was one person who was, again, it was in the consent form, but they just emailed. Maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but and they were like, whoever wrote these dilemmas is psychotic. I felt sick reading this. I was like, holy shit, you could have left any time. But anyways, yes.
So how do you, are studies about, upsetting things just off the table if they need to be, deceived upon it?
Oh no, they're allowed. I mean, I've never had a study rejected for ethical reasons. It's just that you can't do something actually harmful or really distressing. Usually the cutoff is it more distressing than the kind of things you would face in everyday life? So being put in a prison in the basement of university, yeah, that's not typically, I mean, depends what kind of frat group you're in. But typically not, yes.
What does ERB stand for?
Ethical Review Board. That should be in the textbook, but yeah, good question. Any other questions? You're all experts in ethics now. Okay. I believe, animals. I gotta briefly talk about animals. This is shorter because we have less ethical standards with animals, as I said in another class. And basically the idea is, look, yes, try to minimize the amount of suffering that you induce. Don't induce suffering if there's a painless way of achieving the same scientific goal. But it's not the case that you can only induce pain or suffering in animals if there's some kind of practical benefit. You can do it even if it's just for basic research. If you have some scientific question about how the brain works or some other thing, you can do pretty unspeakable things to animals. There's a discussion of the ethics of that. There are people, of course, who criticize this. We could get into that, but this is not an ethics class, so you don't need to know that in any detail. And that is chapters 1 and 2. So there's no new information I have to give you. So, as I've said, this Thursday is the exam. Before we get into the review, I'm going to say a few things about the exam. Number one, if you didn't see the announcement, bring a pencil and bring your student ID card. So there will be a Scantron component to the test. In fact, most of the test will be Scantron. And you'll be showing your ID card when you hand it in at the end. I'll say this now also about the written. Oh, yes, sir.
Do we need a calculator or no?
No, no calculators. Frankly, it wouldn't do you any good anyways. But for the written, one thing I'll say now, and I'll remind you at the day of the test, try to break your question down into parts. So it'll be out of 6. Make it 6 lines. Because Selene, the TA, is grading all of them. I'm grading all of exam 2 and your APA assignment, but she's grading all the short answer for exam 1 and 3. So be nice to her. Write clearly. Have spaces between the 6 components. That will be make it easier for her. And actually, in a bit, I'll be explaining more about what will be in the written. I'm sure you're all interested to hear that. One other thing I'll say that I didn't mention in the announcement, but it is in the syllabus. You will have the full class time to do the exam, so 1 hour and 20 minutes, but I would recommend aiming for 1 hour. The reason is tests 3 and 4 are a bit longer, but you'll have the same amount of time. So tests 1 and 2 have 40 multiple choice and 1 written. Test 3 has 60 multiple choice and 1 written, and test 3 has 70 multiple choice. So if it takes you the full hour and 20, that's okay, no marks off, but maybe you should think, okay, for test 3, I should be a bit more, quick with this. I should study a bit more thoroughly. Okay. Oh, also, pay no attention to how many letters you answer for diff. I once got an exam, and the person had tallied, like how many A's, how many B's, and he had done this formula, like to equalize. Do not do that. Do not. No, that's simple foolishness. Just choose the best answer. Okay. Any questions about the format of the test? Be patient with oh, yes, I saw it. Hand, yeah.
Is it more like application based or like memory based?
I know what you mean. I would say more memory based. Some application maybe, but like I've said before, the key terms list is your best friend. I would say you should be testing yourself on that a lot. You'll remember I gave 4 study tips in the syllabus. Those are all good. There's PowerPoint notes that should be helpful. So there's a lot on eClass you can use. I would say try to make use of that, yes.
In the textbook, there's like more terms in there. Do we have to like know some of those as well as the key terms you already put up?
Yeah, here's what I would say about that. Yeah, let the key terms list guide what you focus on. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Will you provide us with sample questions on eClass or just the?
Yeah, no sample questions. If the uni makes me, I guess so, but I don't think it's required. So no, there's no sample questions. Keep in mind, it's only 15%. You know, if you don't do great on the first test, well, now you know how to study more next time. Even though tests 3 and 4 are a bit longer, the level of difficulty of the multiple choice should stay basically the same. So this is a good chance for you to see kind of what the level of difficulty is, and then you should have an idea for the next ones. And yes, sir.
Aside from the other psychologists and researchers listed on like terms,
Yep.
should we know the background between who discovered what sort of psychological concept?
Yeah, that's a good question. Someone else asked something similar. So obviously, like when I teach, I don't just say definitions of terms. I mean, I'm saying more than just that. So it's not just the terms per se. Like there's links between the terms in various ways. But what I will say is if you know all those terms, you'll be okay. There might be some questions that you may struggle with a bit, but if you just know all those definitions, you're most of the way there, I would say.
I'm not sure if this is like what you just covered, but like we will have to associate like people with what they've done and what
Yes.
their identity.
Yes. Someone else asked about the order and dates. You don't need to know specific dates. This was on course questions. But you should know the rough order in which things happen, because that does matter. So it matters, for example, that behaviorism is a reaction against the views that came before. And it matters that the cognitive revolution was a reaction against that. There's lots of examples like that. I tried to highlight them in class. But the fact that, you know, Wundt started his lab in 1879, I'm not going to ask that. That's not reasonable.
I'm not sure if we talked about B.F. Skinner and John Watson, but is there like a difference, like what they contributed to behaviorism?
There is, but I wouldn't worry about it. You should know they were both behaviorists. John Watson was the first one. Skinner was kind of turned it into the dominant school in psychology. Like Skinner was like the king in like the 40s and 50s. Yeah.
Is there like a practice test or something we can consider ourselves?
No, someone else asked that, but yes, no, there's no practice test. Any other questions? So I'll say too, so my plan is to kind of go through chapters 1 and 2 sort of in a crash course manner, but does anyone have any content questions that are burnt? Oh, that was quick, okay.
Structuralism and functionalism, those are opposing ideas?
I wouldn't say just different, like they're different approaches. I mean, yeah, functionalism, you could say opposing in the sense that functionalists thought that structuralists had the wrong idea of how to study the mind. But it's not as opposing as, say, like monism and dualism, where it's like, no, these are just incompatible. Yeah.
Should we know the computer analogy with cognitive psychology?
Yes. Maybe not in detail, but it does matter that the cognitive people did rely on the analogy of computers to argue that behaviorism was wrong. That it's okay to theorize about what's going on in the mind as long as it leads to predictions about how people should behave. Yeah.
Is the idea of psychodynamics synonymous with Freud's psychoanalysis?
Good question. So you can think of psychodynamic as more of a broad family. There are some people who are it includes all views influenced by Freud that emphasize the unconscious. Psychoanalysis is Freud's therapeutic technique. So it falls under the umbrella of psychoanalysis. It falls under the umbrella of psychodynamic perspectives. In general, if someone was to say, I am a psychoanalytic psychologist, that means they think Freud was Jesus Christ. But someone who says, I'm psychodynamic, that means I'm broadly in the Freudian tradition, but maybe I don't think Freud is Jesus. Like maybe some of the crazy stuff I don't accept, but the fact that unconscious conflict is important, yes, I accept that insight. Good question. Any other questions? Yes.
Is it just all psychology and the sociocultural perspective a part of cognitive revolution, or are they completely different?
The sociocultural perspective comes after the cognitive revolution, and there's some similarity in that sociocultural psychologists often talk about mental processes, so they're not behaviorists, but strictly speaking, it is a different perspective. Yeah. Oh, sorry, you have a follow-up?
Just on psychology.
Sorry?
Just on psychology.
Just Gestalt psychology is related to the cognitive perspective in that it emphasizes kind of mental computation, but it's mainly about perception, so especially visual perception, and the ways in which we like to kind of group things together. Right? You remember that quote, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts? It means that when you put things together, we see something more. We see like a whole or a category or a pattern. I think your hand is up first.
Could you go on again, like what it means when the p-value is too high or low?
Sure. Although, like I said, you don't need to know the details. You only need to know for the test that statistically significant means the p-value is less than 0.05. That's all I'll ask for the test. But conceptually, a low p-value means that it is unlikely that you would get your results if there's no effect. So the people on the antidepressant are 10 out of 10 happy. The people on the placebo are 1 out of 10. You would never get that, but let's just suppose it's extremely unlikely that you would get a difference that big if the drug doesn't work. It's possible, and maybe you just got really lucky with how many happy people you got but it's very unlikely.
So like a low p-value would indicate that like it would be harder to like not get that value get replicated?
It's not directly related to replication per se, although some have tried to make it, there's a way of translating p-value into probability of replication, but forget I said that, don't worry about that. All it means is, like I said, it's unlikely you get that if the thing doesn't work, or if because you just to use an example, so let's say that, the antidepressant people are 6.5, and the placebo people are 6.4, it's totally possible to get that result even if the drug doesn't work. Just fluke. There's a couple more happy people here. But the drug doesn't work. But if it's 10 and 1, pretty unlikely you get that if the drug doesn't work. And I think your hand was up first, sir.
You said that psychoanalysis was a Freud's therapeutic technique.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering how that relates to free association.
Good. Free association is one, so it's kind of like the umbrella is getting smaller. Free association is one of the techniques used by an analyst. It's not the only one. Freud also used dream analysis and other techniques, and also hypnosis, I believe. Free association is just one of the techniques in the tool belt of the psychoanalyst. Good question. Yes?
Are drug manufacturers required to disclose their p-value?
Yep. So in any drug trial worth its salt, there will be a p-value. Want it to be low. Yep.
Range from 0 to 1, like 6.
Oh, good. So these are means. So let's say that the average happiness is 6.5 and 6.4. The p-value here might be, and you'd have to know more information, but it might be like 0.8. It's not that unlikely you'd get a difference that big. Yeah.
Can you explain stratified random sampling?
Yep. So stratified random sampling means that you kind of force your sample to be representative. If you do just random sampling, that's just like eeny, meeny, miny, mo, randomly get people into the study, and you hope that through randomization, it'll be roughly similar to the population in demographics. With stratified, so like one study I did, I think we only use stratification for age, gender, actually, yeah, just age and gender. So let's say 5% of the population is males 20 to 30, and let's say we want 600 people. As soon as we hit X number of, males 20 to 30, no more males 20 to 30. So you're forcing the sample to be representative. Yeah.
Can you explain introspection?
Yep. Introspection was a technique used by the structuralists, and it involves introspecting, or I shouldn't use the word, looking into your own mind. So paying attention inwardly to your own experience and trying to analyze it rigorously. Yep.
Structuralism and cognitive neuroscience is the same because they both use introspection?
No, so cognitive psychologists, the link is both think that it's okay it's okay to theorize about what goes on in people's heads and what they're thinking about. The cognitive people try to test their theories about how people think by connecting it with behavior in some way. So predictions about how people would react in various ways. Whereas cognitive psychologists typically do not use introspection. But you're right, there's a link in that they both think it's okay to theorize about the mind, unlike, say, the behaviorists. Someone behind you had a question.
Do we need to know where in the timeline dualism and monism live?
No, I don't know. So the philosophy stuff, don't worry about the time. That's just kind of background. As long as you know what those terms mean, that's fine. When was Rene Descartes? No, I'm not fast. Other questions? Okay, so how much time do we have? Oh, my phone's there already. Okay, so we got about 35 minutes, so we'll see how far we can get. So the thing I started off with in chapter 1 was the distinction between confirmation bias, which is how people normally reason, and an emphasis on falsification or falsifiability, which is how scientists at least try to reason. So that's a good distinction to have in mind, right? Where confirmation bias. Can anyone tell me the definition of confirmation bias? And in your own words? I see your hand up.
The tendency to see evidence prior to someone's belief.
Almost, not prior to, but that supports your belief. Yeah. That supports what you already think. So you like proving yourself right. But in science, we try to make our theories falsifiable. And for a theory to be falsifiable in science, it has to make specific testable predictions, right? If the theory is true, then this should be observed in the lab when we do the experiment. If that doesn't happen, then the theory's wrong. Like Feynman said, right? Very important. If a theory can't be proven wrong, that's not good. It sounds like it's good, but it's not good. That means that it's unfalsifiable. It doesn't make specific enough predictions to be proven wrong, and that's the problem. It means it's not scientific. I'm not going to go through in detail, but make sure you know the levels of description and the difference between basic and applied research. There's a couple of kind of philosophical debates that you should understand, right? The difference between dualism and monism, and the difference between rationalism and empiricism. Who can define any of these for me? Anyone confident about at least one of these? I saw your hand, yes? Not quite. So it is about knowledge and where knowledge derives from, but rationalism says it can come from just pure thought, just pure rational thinking. In other words, you can just sit in an armchair, close your eyes, and think about stuff. And I mean, look, I kind of took the side of the empiricist on this, but think about mathematics. How do you know that 2 + 2 = 4? Do you have to do an experiment? No, you just, well, 2 and, yeah, seems like it's 4 to me. Now the empiricists have kind of a way around that problem, but at least it looks like 2 + 2 = 4 is not the kind of thing you need to go and do experiments on. You can just think about it and you know. But the empiricists say, no, in order to learn things about the world, you can't just think about it, you have to go and look. You have to go test, measure, observe, and that sort of thing. What about dualism and monism? Does anyone know? Yeah.
For monism, that there's only physical and all like thought and emotion is just a physical process happening.
Exactly, yep. So for monists, at least for the kinds of monists that we're talking about, which is materialists, it's thinking is just a matter of physical processing. And the brain, maybe the body too has some input there, but really the brain. Whereas dualism says there's 2 things. There's the body and the mind, which is this invisible spiritual thing that's connected to the body in some way. Yes?
Would empiricism prevent confirmation bias then, based on
That's a good question. Hopefully a good empiricist would. Now, the only reason I'm hesitating is it's possible to be relying on empirical evidence, but using it in a biased way. I mean, a lot of people who are super biased will present studies and present arguments. They just only pick the observations that, support what they already think. So I think the conjunction of empiricism and falsification and emphasis on falsification is what you need. Any questions about these? Yes?
Sorry, is levels of analysis and levels of description?
Oh, no, good question, no. Or, actually, no, those are just, actually, yes, I take it back. Yeah, you can treat those the same way. Any other questions about these or random things that have popped into your head? Yeah.
Will we need to know about operant conditioning?
Operant conditioning, I don't remember if it's listed. I don't think it's listed in the key terms, but for whatever it's worth, operant conditioning basically just means reward and punishment. It is? Okay, if it is, then yeah, I know it. So operant conditioning, and that's all you'll need to know. Is there just reward and punishment? There's another term I think that might be on there, behavior modification, which I guess is connected, which is the use of operant conditioning to make people do good things and not do bad things. So sometimes they use operant conditioning like in like a hospital or like a mental hospital where it's difficult to control certain people. And so behavior modification would be using reward and punishment to get them to do good things and stop doing bad things. Okay, so as someone I think asked briefly about, the first 2 big schools in psychology were structuralism and functionalism. Structuralism is associated with Wundt, let's call it S, and a technique used by them, which someone asked about, is introspection. So structuralism is like the perspective, introspection is a method of research. And I should say that the structuralists thought that the way to analyze the mind was to try to break it down into its smallest component parts. So what is it made of? Just like they do in chemistry, right? Break it down into the table of elements. Whereas William James, his perspective was called functionalism, and this perspective was strongly influenced by Charles Darwin, and it emphasized the ways in which mental competences are for behavior. James has a quote that I don't think I mentioned: thinking is for doing. The point of having a brain and being able to think is to guide your behavior intelligently. Yes?
When you say breakdown of its smallest parts, do you mean like chemical composition or like individual, like this is for vision, this is for...
Good question. That's a very good question. I can see how it could be misunderstood. Wundt did not mean like physical like parts of the brain. he meant aspects of our conscious experience. So right now I have visual experience, I see a bunch of faces and whatever. A Wundtian approach would mean break it down into things like a particular shade of red. That would be like a mental element, or a particular sound, a particular tone, or whatever. Those would all be mental elements. So it's not like parts of the brain. Neuroscience was very limited back then. Any other questions about these two teams? This one was first, and this one was after. I don't think it'd be fair to say one grew out of the other. I mean, actually, that might be true. I don't know enough about James's intellectual autobiography to know if he worked with. I don't think he would have worked with Wundt or anything. James was an American, and Wundt was a German, so I don't think they directly collaborated. Any other questions about these two? Okay, and then everyone's favorite. Our cocaine-loving friend, Sigmund Freud. So the main thing to remember about Freud is that he emphasized the unconscious. Something in the book that I didn't mention that I'll briefly touch on is his idea of defense mechanisms. Apparently sometimes I've seen it at SNC, let's see here, you can see. Defense mechanisms, which are ways for people to protect themselves against anxiety and threatening information. So, and actually I'll note, I think there's actually a lot of insight here. My professor and I, my supervisor and I, were going to write a paper about this. There are reasons we put it on hold temporarily, but there actually is evidence for some of these. One that the book mentions that you should know is repression. This is probably the most basic defense mechanism, which is what it sounds like: you push thoughts down. Right? Any thought that's kind of unacceptable or you don't want to think about, you push it into the unconscious. That's one. In 105, in the chapter on personality, you'll learn about a lot of other defense mechanisms. As I say, many of them have good empirical support, but we won't talk too much about them. Any questions about Dr. Freud? Yes? It's a good question. I don't know. You have to ask Freud. Well, he's dead. You'd have to ask a Freudian, I guess. Yeah, that's beyond my expertise. It's a good question, though. If you didn't hear, she asked, how does the conscious mind push things into the unconscious if it can't access it? And actually, I think the answer might be, because it's the ego that represses things. And I believe Freud thought that part of the ego was unconscious. So maybe that's the answer, but I'm not a Freudian expert, so I'm not sure about that. Sure. Actually, I'm pretty sure they're not on the test. I'm very confident they're not on the test. But I just mentioned that as an example. Freudian slip is just where some element of the unconscious that you've repressed away kind of slips out, it kind of pops out. Like the video I showed, right? There's a kind of unacceptable or weird thing that you're thinking, and then it comes out. But that's not on the test. Yeah.
What's the difference between Ivan Pavlov, John Watson, and B.S. Skinner?
Good question. So that's in the next one. Any questions on Freud before I go to the behaviorists? Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah, I can quickly review that too. So there's three aspects of the personality according to Freud: the ego, the superego, and the id. I said that ego means I. I was listening to the video. I sometimes listen to it to make sure I didn't make any mistakes. And I said ego means I. I don't mean like eyeball. I mean like the letter I. Like in German, I forget what it is, but it's like Ike or something. This means I and super I. So this is you. This is like yourself that kind of makes the final decision. The super I, or super ego, is your conscience, so your sense of right and wrong, the culture kind of drums into you. And the id is raw animal desire. In German, the word that's translated is, it just means it, like IT. It's the kind of animal, physical part of mentality. So that's what those three are. Yep.
Can you go over unconscious, just the definition of unconscious?
Yeah, unconscious is just any thinking that you don't have conscious access to. So, I can give examples, but yeah, so thinking it could be, for example, things that are repressed. Any memory or thinking that you push out of awareness, that would be in the unconscious. I saw a hand somewhere else. Sorry?
What was super?
Your conscience, so your sense of right and wrong. Are dreams related to psychology? Yes, so we'll be talking about Freud's theory of dreams in chapter 6, but you don't need to worry about that right now. Any other Freud questions? Yep. Which one? The id, you mean? I would say instinct. Intuition that's more of a cognitive concept. I'm not sure Freud would put it that way. It's like things like desire for sex or for food or for dominance. Those would be id things. It's just me, I want. The id is very dumb in Freudian theory. Babies are all id, according to Freud. They come in, they want to be warm and well fed and happy, and that's it. They have none of this other business. By the way, Freud was a huge sexist. He thought that women never developed a superego. So, which, if anything, well, no, I won't say that. Okay. Should probably move on just so we have time for everyone. So someone asked about Pavlov and Watson and Skinner. Ivan Pavlov is not a psychologist. He was a physiologist who discovered classical conditioning by doing experiments on dog saliva. His work was used by the behaviorists, but he was not a behaviorist. He was not really a psychological kind of person. So John Watson, who was a psychologist, he started the school of behaviorism, and B.F. Skinner kind of popularized it. So that's what you should know about those three theories. You should know the three core components of behaviorism. And those three are as follows. Number one, we should only study behavior. That's where the word behaviorist comes from. Number two, so in other words, don't think about people's beliefs or desires or emotions. Just forget all that nonsense, according to them. Number two, humans are blank slates. Right? So there's they were on the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate. They did not think innate differences explained differences in human behavior. So they're all nurture. And number three, the way in which the environment shapes us is classical and operant conditioning, just different kinds of conditioning. So you should know those three as well.
What was number three?
The way in which the environment shapes us is conditioning. Different types of conditioning.
What is Skinner do?
So both of these are behaviorists. Skinner was the one who made behaviorism dominant in psychology. He made it the main deal, especially in the United States. He was a very odd fella. He raised his daughter in like this weird conditioning environment. It kind of messed up. But anyways.
Sorry, what was the first part of the behaviorism?
It's the easiest one to remember. Only study behavior. Don't study the mind. Just look at what you can directly observe. As I think I mentioned, they were sort of extreme empiricists. Just stick really close to only what you can directly observe, which in the case of humans means what we do. So that's what you can see.
I think you've kind of answered it already, but why is Skinner's beliefs kind of considered like extreme?
Extreme in the sense that, in other sciences, it's perfectly okay to theorize about things you can't see, as long as those theories lead to predictions about things you can see. I believe I gave the example of fusion in the sun. So physicists have a pretty good idea of what goes on inside the sun. They have theories about how fusion works. No one's ever been in there to measure it. It's a theory. It's a theory about something you can't directly observe. But the theory leads to predictions about how the sun should behave, and therefore it's testable. But Skinner and Watson say, don't even make theories about things you can't see. And I think that's taking empiricism kind of too far. And so do most psychologists and philosophers today. Although there are still some, maybe not quite behaviors, but some people who are sympathetic to that. I had one prof who was kind of behavioristic in some of his views. Any other questions about these dudes? No hands. Okay. 1, 2. The humanists, I'll just say very briefly, you can think of them as kind of the positive people. You know, they have a really optimistic vision of human nature. You should know that they rejected determinism, so they do not think everything is predetermined by the laws of nature. They had a very strong belief in free will. And that they thought that we should all be striving towards self-actualization, so achieving our unique potential. And then the cognitive people, the cognitive perspective came after the behaviorists. And that's important to kind of understand the order. So as I said, the behaviorists said you should only study behavior. Don't think about the mind. And the cognitive people, relying on an analogy with computers that someone mentioned, said no, it's okay to theorize about the mind, as long as your theories lead to predictions.
Is there any important people we need to know for humans, like maybe modify?
No, I don't think they're listed. If they're not listed, then don't worry about them. They'll come up in a later chapter, although not in this class, in 1 of 5.
What's the humanists?
Is which the humanist?
With the reaching your potential?
Yep, that's the humanist, yep.
So the order we're talking about them is the order they came up.
Is the order they came up in the history? Yeah. Yeah, the order in the book is roughly chronological. There's some overlap, but I usually try to emphasize when the order matters. One exception to that, I guess, is the Gestalt people, who technically came before the cognitive people. That doesn't really matter much, but the Gestalt people emphasized the ways in which perception is a pattern-seeking process. So when we look at the world, we as animals are pattern-seeking. We try to group things together. They have this famous line that the textbook mentions, which is, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Think of that triangle example, right? There's 3 circles with chunks cut out of them. When you see that, you don't just see all those parts, you see a triangle, even though in fact there's no triangle there. So that's what the Gestalt people studied. They studied the ways in which our perception gets organized by the mind. We have 15 minutes, we're still in chapter 1, which that's okay. By the way, there is office hours today, as always. So I think it's like half an hour after class. And I am willing to stay longer today, given that it's just before exam day. So if you have further questions that don't get answered, you're welcome to come to office hours or to put questions on course questions. But we'll see how much we can bang out in the next 15 minutes. I don't have too much to add to the socio-cultural perspective. Any questions about that perspective? For behavior genetics, so you should know about twin studies. I talked a bit about twin studies. We'll be talking more about the details in chapter 4, but as long as you have a general sense of how the twin studies work, you should be fine. And then evolutionary psychology we talked about, so we talked about how natural selection works, which you should know, and the ways in which evolutionary psychologists seek to apply evolutionary concepts to human behavior. So the ways in which our capacities were selected for because of their reproductive advantage. Any questions about the two kind of genetic perspectives, behavior genetics and evolutionary psychology? Yep.
Evolutionary psychology come last?
Yes, I guess so. I never thought of it like that, but yeah, I mean, you could arguably date it all the way back to Darwin. Darwin wrote a book called The Expression of Emotion in Animals and Men in the 18-somethings. But it didn't really become what it is. It didn't really emerge as a separate discipline until the 1990s. So I guess, yeah. Sure, yeah, so that's jumping ahead, which is fine, we only have a bit of time left. So there's different names for each of them. I'll just call them the kind of easier ones to contrast them. So within subjects and between subjects. The book has different names for both, but it has this name and another name, but here's the basic difference. Between subjects is kind of the easier one to understand, and if you get no other information, you should assume, oh, I just realized, I have to tell you about the written question. Let's do that first, then I'll come back to this. The written question, the moment you've all been waiting for. First of all, can anyone guess? Well, I guess I'm kind of giving it away. In the PowerPoint notes, I made a point of saying the next 7 slides are the most important thing in this course.
Correlations.
Yeah, the correlation and experiments. That was kind of a hint, kind of a slow pitch over the plate for you guys. Here's what the question will roughly be. I will describe a positive correlation. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it'll be some correlation I just made up between 2 variables. I want you to explain why we can't infer cause and effect from that correlation. Remember, there's always 3 possibilities. You'll have to say what those are. And if you have questions, I can answer them after I say what they are. I'm happy to go over it. You have to say what the 3 possibilities are, and then you'll have to describe how you would design an experiment to test whether there's a cause and effect relationship. And your explanation will have to include the words independent variable and dependent variable. So it'll be out of 6 in total. 3 for the 3 possibilities, 1 for correctly describing how an experiment is set up, and 1 for independent variable, 1 for dependent variable, and getting it right. So there you go. So I won't tell you exactly what the correlation will be, but that's what the question is. See, lots of times. I think yours is up.
So you're designing an experiment to test causation or correlation?
Causation. Yeah. So yeah, I'm just going to tell you what the correlation is between A and B, whatever A and B are, and then I'm going to say, okay, how would you prove with an experiment, how would you give evidence that A causes B? I saw another hand somewhere over here. Question has been answered. Okay, any other questions about that? No, so the way it's going to work, that's a good question. The multiple choice and the short answer are just kind of separate grades. So the written questions are all 3%. So this one's 3%, next one's 3%, and then exam 3 is 3%, exam 4 there's no written. And then the multiple choice is 12%, so for a total of 15. And when you'll get your grades back, you'll get the multiple choice grades back like probably in a few days, because I just give it to a dude who puts it through a machine. But the written, I'm going to ask Selene to have it graded by the next exam review day. I'm doing that because I've been a TA and I know it sucks to grade that many things. So hopefully you'll have the grades back by the next exam review day for the written, but for the multiple choice, you should have it in a few days. Yeah?
Does the written question, how are you going to grade it? Is it depend on how much you write?
No. In fact, I would encourage concision if you know what you're talking about. So it's not a matter of detail. It's a matter of, do you get the 3 possibilities right? It could be 1 line each for those 3. And then for the experiment, it's, do you describe how an experiment is done correctly? That could be like maybe 2 sentences. Like it should not be super complicated. And then say what the independent variable is, what the dependent variable is, maybe a little bit about why you can infer cause and effect, but it should not be super long. It shouldn't need to be if you know what you're talking about. Yeah.
For the experiment we're supposed to design, are we connecting that to the graph?
To the what?
Are we connecting it to the graph that you gave us in the question?
There won't be a graph for the question. I'll just say A and B are positively correlated. So describe what the 3 possibilities are for that. Any other questions about that? I saw some other hands somewhere. Oh.
Can you say how many multiple choice questions there are?
Yep, 40. So first test has 40. Second, it's 20 per test is per chapter. So 20 on chapter 1, 20 on chapter 2, and then for exam 2 it'll be 40, and then exam 3 is 60 because there's 3 chapters. Any other questions? Alex? 7 minutes left. Okay. So I'm sorry, I was going to talk about this. So, if you get no other information, you should assume that we're talking about between subjects experiments. So in the written, just do one of these. It's just simpler. So between subjects means you get a group, you randomly assign them to 2 conditions. Random assignment is crucial, because then you're making the 2 groups basically the same, right? And then you do something to one group and don't do it to the other group. That might help you on the written. And then you're going to compare to see if there's a difference between the 2 conditions, the two groups. So it's between people. Within subjects, you get one group and you do both things to them. So when we did that word pair game, that was a within subjects experiment. It was a defective one because it didn't have counterbalancing, but the idea is there. You do the same thing to everyone in the group. You don't divide into 2 groups. Yeah.
It's just a logistical thing when we come in for the test next Thursday. What's the process like?
You'll open the door, you'll walk in, so you'll just sit down and the TA and I will just hand out the exams. Getting here early is good because we'll probably start handing out around like 9:25, maybe even slightly earlier. If you come in late, obviously we'll just give you an exam. And then you'll write your name on the front and student ID. But one thing I'll say too, just so there's no confusion, when you come forward, you're going to be handing in 3 things. The written is at the back, which by the way, I recommend you do the written first. Just come in ready. You got the written kind of already ready what you're going to write. Just flip to the back, do that, and it's done. Then you can just do the multiple choice. And then, because then if you're crunched for time, you can kind of go a bit quickly through the last 2 multiple choice. But if you have to rush through the written, that's not so great. But then you're going to rip that part off, the written, and then hand in the rest of the exam, the written, and the Scantron. There's going to be 3 piles up here. And you'll bring your student ID at the end. So that's going to be the procedure. Yeah.
Do we have to write the written with a pencil, or can we use it?
Written, I don't care. You can do pencil or pen. The Scantron must be in pencil.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Just like HB number 2 for the Scantron?
I don't know what that means. I'm sure it's fine. Other questions? Yep.
What was that term and it wasn't confirmation bias? It was like looking back on something.
Oh yeah. Do you mean hindsight?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So hindsight bias is the tendency to think, I already knew that. You know, I knew it all along. So you hear something, you hear some fact, and you tell yourself, oh yeah, that's obvious. You know, I already knew that. Okay, so we have a few minutes left. I have not much else to say, so I'll stick around for a bit. You can come up and ask questions if you want, but the rest of you are free to go. I'll be in office hours today if you have more questions as well. Good luck on Thursday. Thank you.